Grove City, Ohio, once a large farming hub, is now an ideal spot for both residents and visitors. It's perfect for anyone who enjoys nature, rich history, and culture. Several state parks are nearby, offering a variety of activities, from hiking and kayaking to playing in paintball fields and picking pumpkins. The city is also just a 15-minute drive from Ohio State University, which serves around 60,000 students. In 2017, one of those proud students was 21-year-old Reagan Delaney. Her family had recently relocated from Ohio to Florida for work, but Reagan stayed behind in Columbus. Ohio State was her only choice for a university, and it was the only one she applied to. When she was younger, her father, Toby, had taken her to a football game there, and that experience had solidified her decision. She was so sure of her acceptance that she told everyone she'd gotten in even before hearing back. True to her confidence, she was accepted and fully immersed herself in university life. She majored in psychology and had already secured a job for after graduation. Her plan was to work for a few years and then open her own practice. Reagan was a devoted family member, especially close to her father, Toby, her mother, Lisa, and her younger sister, Mackenzie, whom she affectionately called Gigi. She spoke to them multiple times a day. Despite her busy college life, she always found time for her loved ones. Her mother recalled that Reagan had been a lively, energetic child who was always ready to face any challenge. Lisa said her daughter's compassion was clear from an early age, always drawn to those who were alone and in need of a friend. Lisa often had to wait in the road while Reagan gently rescued little bugs, saving them from being stepped on because she couldn't stand to see anything or anyone hurt. The Tox family also spent a lot of time at church, and during the holiday periods Reagan would often travel and do missions for the church as well. She was described as funny and goofy, a real chatterbox and a social butterfly. Reagan loved all things sports, playing varsity tennis and lacrosse. So with everything to do in Grove City, it was the perfect place for her. She lived off campus with her 4 roommates, Jackie, Madison, Kirsten, and Stephanie. They had all been put together at random, but there was an instant click, and they quickly became the closest of friends. A few of them even worked together at the same local restaurant. Reagan had had a tough time lately. However, as she and her boyfriend Jake had mutually split, Reagan was so focused on finishing her degree and coming out with top marks that they had agreed it was best to get their studies out of the way with no distractions. And after that, whatever was meant to be would be. Her roommate said she had taken the breakup hard, but the pair still talked a lot and said they would always be best friends. As she was now coming to the end of her final year, she posted on social media about her father buying her a nice frame for her diploma, and it was clearly an emotional time for her. In February 2017, she was just a few months away from graduating, busier than ever trying to get everything ticked off. On the evening of February 8th, Reagan left her apartment to head to a shift at Bodega Bar and Restaurant. All was fairly quiet that evening, and she clocked off just before 10 p.m. heading to her car, which she, along with others, always parked in the street behind the restaurant. Reagan always messaged everyone to tell them she had made it back home. Everyone was 1,000 miles away from her, and she never wanted anyone to worry. But this evening no messages came in despite the fact she had been texting her dad only an hour before she left. Her sister Mackenzie messaged her at 10:30 p.m. The message was delivered, but there was no reply. Over the next 4 hours, Toby called and texted her repeatedly, but her phone just rang and rang. At around 2 a.m., the ring stopped, and it seemed that her battery had died. The following morning, everyone woke up and checked their phones right away. No replies and no missed calls from Reagan. Had she got into a car accident on the way home? Or was it something totally innocent, like she went to a friend's house and just hadn't taken her charger? Although they wanted to believe it was the latter, deep down they knew this wasn't like her, and it would have been impossible for her to ignore so much activity on her phone, nor would she have wanted to. Back at her accommodation, Kirsten knocked on Reagan's door, but her room was empty. Her bed was neatly made and her school bag was on the side. Jackie, Madison, and Stephanie hadn't heard her come home either, and a feeling of unease began to set in with them as well. They started posting to social media and ringing around other classmates. Lisa called the university and they confirmed that Reagan hadn't turned up to her morning class. It was now all too much, so she hung up and called the police. But whoever she spoke to said she was unable to file a missing persons report as she wasn't the last person to have seen her. The last person or people would have been those at Bodega, so Reagan's roommates went back there. Her manager said she had definitely been and left that night. And although her car was not parked outside, there was evidence that she had left in it. He wasted no time and successfully managed to file the missing persons report. As everybody was still searching, at about noon dispatchers got a call from a distressed member of the public. Near an entrance to a park in Grove City, he had found the naked body of a young woman partially buried under the snow. When police arrived, it was clear that she was already dead. She had no purse or phone on her, and none of her clothes were nearby either. She had a small tattoo of a circle and a small necklace. But apart from that, there was nothing around that might help identify her. Just after 3 p.m., her roommates who were still at Bodega caught wind that the body of a young woman had been found. And when police arrived to take their missing persons report, they asked them about the small tattoo. They felt sick to their stomachs as they said Reagan had a tattoo that matched it. And a few hours later, the news that everyone had been trying to avoid thinking about would soon be confirmed. They had found the body of Reagan Tokes. An autopsy confirmed that she had been raped and shot in the back of the head and in the side of her face. The bullets still lodged in her head. Experts could tell she had been shot from behind, and it was almost a close-range execution-style killing. Police said it was unclear as to whether she was shot where she was found or if she was killed elsewhere and moved, as they couldn't find any shell casings. Word was traveling so fast the police couldn't keep a lid on things. This resulted in Reagan's sister Mackenzie learning of her sister's death via an Instagram post. Lisa said her daughter had no enemies and there was no one she could think of that would have wanted to hurt her, let alone do something like this. But in Ohio, there was something else at the back of everyone's minds, something that had been plaguing the community for a while. In the previous weeks, the area had been hit with a string of attacks and burglaries, each one more frightening than the last. People were being grabbed from behind and threatened or attacked with a gun or knife, and the perpetrator, who was always wearing a mask, demanded their bags or wallets. Police didn't know who the person was or if the attacks were connected, but was it possible that Reagan being killed was linked to these? One woman who was subjected to one of these attacks said the minute she heard what had happened to Reagan, she felt in her gut that it was all connected, believing that the man who had attacked her would absolutely have killed her if he had the chance. But investigators had little to go on with these leads, and the interviews had to start with those closest to her, including her ex-boyfriend, Jake. He was instantly put on the police's radar as not only had they just broken up, he had posted to Instagram about her death, and detectives said something about the post gave them a strange feeling. But Reagan's roommate said there was absolutely no way he could have been involved. He adored her and the couple had never even argued. Jake was devastated about it all and was just trying to process things in the best way he could. There was really nothing to look into as far as his post went. It was just a tribute from someone who had lost someone very close to him. His alibi checked out and the police moved on with their investigations. The camera inside Bodega could only capture a little bit of her leaving, but it didn't seem that anyone was watching or following her. Using license plate technology, detectives were finally able to locate Reagan's car. It had been parked up on a residential street not too far away. There had clearly been an attempt made to set fire to it, with cigarette burns throughout and the smell of gasoline inside. But this hadn't worked, and officers were able to collect several items. Some cigarette butts, a gas canister, and a few ATM receipts were taken in for testing and analysis. The ATM receipts showed that several attempts had been made to withdraw large sums of money, but these had been declined. One successful withdrawal was made, which was for $60 as they waited to have more information from the banks. The community was grappling with what had happened. A lot of students were now worried about walking to and from campus by themselves, wondering if they could be next. And the university and police had little to say to comfort or reassure them. Jake organized a fundraiser for the Tokes family with the hopes that it would one day go towards setting up a scholarship in Reagan's name. She loved her university and had been so ready and excited to graduate, and he knew she would want to give something back to another student. It soon raised almost $100,000 48 hours after Reagan's body was found. detectives had their first solid lead. CCTV linked to the ATM receipts showed that it was Reagan withdrawing and attempting to withdraw the money at those times. And although they couldn't see who was in the car with her, they were confident that someone was in there and they were likely forcing her to do it. It wasn't long before the officers got a hit on the DNA on the cigarette butts, and they were shocked that it was so fast. But it was because it had come back to somebody already in the police's system, someone with a lot of past convictions. A 29-year-old called Brian Lee Golsby, and he had only been out of prison for a few months. He was known to police in many different areas, and the more they looked into Brian's history, the more frightening it all became. He had been committing crimes since he was a child and was now a convicted Tier 3 sex offender. According to a juvenile sex offender assessment filed by the Ohio Department of Youth Services, he had raped 5-year-old girls and 6-year-old boys as an adolescent. His crimes had continued, and in 2011 he had abducted a woman who was 8 months pregnant at the time, along with her 2-year-old son, holding them at knife point. He had sexually assaulted her in front of her child and forced her to drive to different ATMs to take out money. He then made her drive to her house where he assaulted her again, forced her to wash herself and brush her teeth to get rid of any DNA, and stole some things before fleeing. There was enough evidence from inside the car, however, to send him to trial, but the victim was so traumatized she couldn't face testifying. So Brian took a plea deal. He went from being charged with 2 armed robberies, rape and kidnapping, to pleading guilty to robbery and attempted rape. He got 6 years in prison, but was released several months early. After he was let out, he had gone to stay in temporary housing, which was monitored. But officials at the housing program and his parole officer had not been properly supervising him, despite the fact he was labeled as high risk and wearing an ankle monitor the whole time. He had repeatedly violated the terms of his probation. And from looking at his monitor, it was clear that the attacks and robberies in the weeks before Reagan was killed were all linked to Brian. Everything was connected. Despite everything his monitor was showing, people were shocked to learn that the information collected from the monitors does not go directly to the police. The data will normally go to the privately owned companies that make them, and then it is up to them to pass it all on. In this case, this hadn't been done or checked on, and he had no curfews associated with his monitor. Brian's monitor had placed him in all of the locations Reagan had been that night, starting with being right near Reagan's car. Every street and every ATM was connected to him, and they could back this up with CCTV footage. They also found footage of him buying the gas canister that was found in Reagan's car. Results from the rape test kit came back too, and this was also a match for Brian Golsby. On February 11th at 4 a.m. a SWAT team stormed his house and placed him in handcuffs. He went into a 6-hour interview with the same detectives that had arrested him 6 years prior. Brian seemed upset and said he had nothing to do with Reagan's death or sexual assault. He did admit that he had been in her car, however, but he said that the only thing he was interested in was robbing her. He said he had forced his way into her car and made her drive to various cash points and later the park, where he told her to strip down, turn around, and wait 30 minutes before she left. He then sped off in her car before dumping it. He was adamant that she was alive when he left. Police asked if there was anyone else involved, hoping to get him to trip himself up if he tried to blame another person. As officers started presenting the DNA evidence, he then changed his story. He said he was there when Reagan was shot but denied being her killer. He told them it was all down to a man named TJ, who he owed some money to. Brian claimed that after they had got the money from Reagan, he assumed that they would let her go. But he said TJ had forced him to rape her before TJ pulled the gun on her. Why on earth would he do this? Detectives asked. Brian said he didn't know, but TJ was threatening to hurt his children and he had to protect them. He said that Reagan had tearfully said over and over, "All I want to do is live." Brian said that TJ had told Reagan to strip and start walking into the field. He then shot her once in the back of the head, went and stood over her before shooting her in the side of her face. His account of what happened and what she had said was so specific, officers knew he was talking about himself. There was nothing found in Reagan's car that pointed towards anyone else being in it, apart from Brian, and he couldn't tell them anything about TJ. Officers said that Brian's history of violence spoke for itself, and every crime he had committed over the last few weeks was by himself. It was a totally convoluted story, but they played along hoping he would tell them more. He let them know where Reagan's clothes were hidden, where the gun and shell casings had been thrown, and where her phone was. Lieutenant Brian Davidson, who was conducting the interviews, said his eyes were pure evil. There was just nothing there. 29-year-old Reagan Golsby was charged with the aggravated murder, rape, aggravated robbery, and the kidnapping of Reagan Tokes. Despite his denials, he went on to make 2 calls in his jail, one to his girlfriend and one to a friend, confessing everything. "I did it. I killed that girl for money," he said. The police's timeline of events that evening was now almost complete. At 9:45 p.m., as Reagan was leaving her shift, Brian forced her into her own car and demanded that she drive to an ATM. At 2 minutes past 10, Reagan drove to a Chase Bank where she attempted to withdraw $500 for Brian, but this was declined. About 10 minutes later, the pair were at Huntington Park and CCTV showed Reagan again, trying to withdraw the money. This transaction was also declined. Between 10:18 p.m. and 10:30 p.m., Brian forced Reagan to park in a dark alley where he raped her. After this, he got her to go back to the first bank so she could withdraw $60. Between 11:12 and 11:41, footage from the gas station picked up the pair in the car again. Sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., they drove to Scioto Grove Metro Park. He forced her to take off her clothes and start walking into the dark field as she begged for her life. He then shot her twice in the head before using her car to get away. He drove to his girlfriend's home, and at about 1:45 a.m., they went to McDonald's, likely to give himself an alibi. He later disposed of the gun and shell casings in a sewer before unsuccessfully trying to set the car on fire. In a final disturbing twist, Brian gave his girlfriend Reagan's purse and wallet as a gift, saying it was an early Valentine's Day present. On February 15th, in the church she had attended since she was a child, Reagan's funeral was held. It was absolutely packed with those closest to her and those who had never even met her once or spoken to her. Brian arrived in court to hear the charges read out. Toby stood watching him through the glass. He said he was so angry, emotional, and shaky, he was surprised he didn't have a heart attack that day. Toby said as everything started to come out about his past, it was as confusing that he had got away with so much as it was shocking. They had a monster in their grasp, in their control, and they let him slip, he said. Despite his confessions and all the evidence, Brian still entered a plea of not guilty and trial prep got underway. 3 months after she was killed, the day she had been working so hard for finally came around, and it was a somber and bittersweet moment for the students and university. Graduation day. Reagan's family stood in her place and accepted her degree posthumously. The emotion could be felt as everyone gave her a standing ovation. Her family statement read, "Reagan wanted to be a Buckeye ever since she was a little girl. Today her dream became a reality as she was awarded a diploma from the Ohio State University. As her parents and family, we are so proud of her and her accomplishment. The opportunity for a college education is a gift. Along with this gift, one must also have desire, dedication, discipline, and determination. Reagan had all of this and then some, and so did all the other students today who received their diploma. We congratulate them on their achievement and ask that they take their gift and use it to make a difference in this world. Make it a better place as Reagan wanted to do, but now isn't able to do so physically." In mid-March 2018, Brian's trial began. His legal team were up against it given all the evidence. It was clearly a very strong case in more ways than one, so they were hoping at the very least to steer the jury away from the potential of the death penalty. He had confessed, so it wasn't really a case of proving his innocence. It was more a case of saving his life. They leaned on his childhood, saying he had an abusive mother and addiction issues. They also claimed he was raped himself as a child, although the prosecution said his stories were inconsistent. His lawyer said that the DNA that was found inside Reagan and on the cigarette butts was unreliable as it was linked to a DNA profile of Brian from a previous crime in 2010. She also said that Brian wasn't smart enough to purposely plan such an awful crime, saying, "I submit to you that if Mr. Goldsby didn't want to get caught, then perhaps he should have not worn the GPS bracelet. Not only that, he charged it. He didn't want to let the battery die. But the prosecution said his level of intelligence was irrelevant and it changed nothing. He went out to hunt that night and he found Reagan totes. There's no mystery here, they said. On what would have been Reagan's 23rd birthday, Brian was found guilty on all 9 counts. But the jury couldn't agree on what the sentencing should be. 4 voted for life in prison and 8 voted for the death penalty. Brian was handed 3 life sentences without the chance of parole, and he was also later sentenced to a further 66 years in prison for the attacks and armed robberies he had committed in the days before Reagan's murder. He was sent to serve his time in Ohio State Penitentiary, a maximum security prison. His team filed a couple of appeals, but these were dropped and dismissed. County Prosecutor Ron O'Brien was disappointed, believing the death penalty should have been the only outcome, and he continued to fight for the outcome he thought was right. In 2018, he filed a 53-page motion requesting a cross appeal. This was based on instructions that the judge had given the jury, which meant they could consider mitigating factors presented by the defense that had in fact never happened. Things that Brian had said where he had presented differing versions of events and stories that could easily be picked apart by the prosecution were allowed to be taken into consideration. Finally, in April 2019, Ohio's 10th District Court of Appeals granted the state's authority to appeal. But the court ruled that the judge's instructions had been correct and proper. He filed another appeal, but to his disappointment, the Ohio Supreme Court would eventually dismiss the appeal completely. Ron said he was trying to stay positive, adding, "The good news is that he will die in prison." After everything came out about the failings of the system, Reagan's family vowed to change it. The system is flawed and changes need and will happen as a result of this senseless tragedy. We will work our entire lives if necessary to make this happen, they said. And that they did. In 2018, they settled a lawsuit with the company that was housing and supposed to be supervising Brian. And in 2019, the Reagan's hoax law came into effect, with the Ohio State Supreme Court ruling the law constitutional several years later. What had come to happen as a result of him not being properly monitored, checked on, or recalled to prison when he should have prompted a much-needed change in the law and how criminals are handled. The Reagan-Tokes Act allows courts to impose an indefinite sentence with a minimum and maximum prison term for first- and second-degree felonies when a life sentence is not possible. While Brian was incarcerated, he had committed 52 different violations and, as a result, was moved to 5 different prisons. But under Ohio law, this could make no difference to his sentence. In fact, he was released 6 months early. Under the new change, the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction can now change an inmate's incarceration up to the maximum sentence imposed by the court for committing crimes in prison or breaking rules. It would also hopefully alter how prisoners are monitored and housed after they are released. And this would include a change in the use of ankle monitors. From Jake's fundraiser and many donations, the Reagan Delaney Tokes Memorial Foundation Scholarship was set up. It allows 2 Ohio State students per year tuition and accommodation. Self-defense classes were also offered around the area in Reagan's name too. A space at Scioto Grove Metropark was created to remember the 21-year-old, and it was called the Tranquility Garden. Her family's hope was that the area could become a place of peace, instead of associating it with the awful things that had happened that morning. There's a water feature which represents her astrological sign. Her favorite color, blue, can be found all around it. And there is plenty of wildlife and nature, which Reagan loved. There are also 5 buckeye trees as a nod to her time as a student at Ohio State, which was quite simply her favorite place to be. Her ex-boyfriend Jake has not spoken out much since Reagan died, but he did talk about their first date, which sums up her character perfectly. "We went apple picking and she saw this perfect apple at the top of one of the trees and she just had to have it. The problem was neither of us could reach it. So I had the bright idea of putting her on my shoulders, but before I could even see why she needed this apple so bad, she proceeded to shove it in my mouth and make me take a huge bite out of it. I didn't know why she did that until she later told me she wanted to find the biggest, most red apple and give it to me so I could enjoy it. That was the type of girl she was, always thinking about others before herself. And when I say always, I truly mean that. From the moment I met her up until the last time I spoke with her, she was always making me a better person. I will always love her. She was my best friend and always will be. The last couple of hours of Reagan's life must have been so harrowing it does not bear thinking about. Her tearful pleas to be allowed to live, standing alone in a cold, dark field. Everyone had the same things to say about Reagan Tokes, and they were nothing but good. Deeply compassionate and kind, always seeing the best in everyone and everything, and someone whose potential to achieve and help so many was limitless. Her mother Lisa said it best: "Love will always overcome everything." Discover the chilling world of secret crime mysteries, where we delve into the most perplexing cold cases and unsolved crimes. Join us as we unravel hidden clues and explore haunting mysteries. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to bring these cases to light. 48-year-old Lucy Schuman was a recent graduate of the University of Louisville School of Medicine. She traveled from her home in Kentucky to the Virgin Islands in September of 2019, where she stayed in a rental property in Coral Bay on the island of St. John. The owner of the rental property reported Lucy missing on September 19th when Lucy failed to check out on time, and they found Lucy's belongings, but not Lucy still at the property. The Jeep Lucy had rented for her trip was subsequently found in the parking lot near the entrance to the Salt Pond Bay Trail in Virgin Islands National Park. Lucy's day pack, with her passport inside of it, was found near the top of the Ram Head Trail, which connects with the Salt Pond Bay Trail. The search for Lucy was initially on the trails and the more accessible areas of the park near where her car and pack were found. Rangers from Virgin Islands National Park, St. John Rescue, the Virgin Islands Police, and the Coast Guard were all involved with the search, which also benefited from the help of local volunteers. However, when the early searches failed to locate Lucy, the effort to find her became more physically taxing on those working to locate her. The Ram Head Trail, where Lucy's pack was found, runs down the southernmost peninsula on the island. The remote area features dense vegetation and rocky terrain off of the trail. Search dog teams were brought in from Puerto Rico and St. Croix. A team from the U.S. Geological Survey used drones, which they normally use for mapping purposes, to search the area, and the Coast Guard searched the water along the southern coast of the island with a helicopter. The possibility that Lucy had fallen off of a cliff and into the water seemed like an obvious scenario. But Thomas Kelly, a spokesperson for Virgin Islands National Park, told NBC News that because of the jagged rocks below the cliffs of the peninsula, Lucy's body would have been discovered relatively quickly had she fallen, as it would have landed on the rocks rather than in the water. The water was still searched by snorkelers and scuba divers. After a few days, the search was impacted by Tropical Storm Karen, although the storm itself did not impact St. John as severely as initially forecast. Almost a dozen employees from the Park Service were due to travel to St. John from all over the country to lend their technical expertise to the search, but the island's airports and marinas were shut down on September 23rd in anticipation of the storm. They reopened on the 25th, and the Park Service employees arrived the following day. 5 of those employees were technical climbing rangers from parks ranging from Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. They climbed down cliffs along the shore and into small crevices on the island looking for any sign of Lucy. None was found. On October 2nd, after nearly 2 weeks of extensive searches using diverse methods but resulting in no new clues, Virgin Islands National Park made the decision to scale back the search for Lucy. The search would continue, but in a more limited capacity. Following the announcement, National Service Incident Commander Scott Gunther conveyed his gratitude to everyone who helped search for Lucy. A member of Lucy's family wrote a letter to the volunteers saying, "We are grateful for your dedication and generosity of spirit in the search for Lucy. Your selflessness and kindness will always be remembered. No further clues in the case have been found and Lucy remains missing." Stephanie Stewart was 70 years old and very petite, barely over 5 feet tall and weighing just over 100 pounds. However, she was decidedly not weak or frail, having recently climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. She had previously biked solo across Canada. Perhaps because of her love of activity and the outdoors, she was still physically strong and in good health. "Mom's a hell of a woman," her daughter Lori has said of her. "She's very strong. She's very capable." Stephanie spent her winters in the resort town of Canmore, Alberta. And from April to September, working as a fire spotter, climbing up a ladder to a watchtower every day to watch her remote surroundings for signs of smoke and radioing in for help in the event of a forest fire. During the season, she lived alone in a cabin at the base of the tower, but kept busy even when she was not working, maintaining a large garden and reading stacks of books and keeping up with her hobbies of painting and embroidering. Stephanie had worked as a fire spotter for 18 seasons and had been assigned to the Athabasca Watchtower in western Alberta, on the outskirts of Jasper National Park, for the last 13 of them. She was there on August 25, 2006, when the last known communication from her occurred. She spoke on the phone with one of her relatives around 9 p.m., and everything sounded normal. The following morning, however, Stephanie failed to make the first of her 3 daily radio check-ins. She then failed to answer any radio calls to her, so another employee was sent out to the Athabasca Watchtower to check on her. When they arrived, they found Stephanie's truck in the gravel driveway. When they approached the cabin, they found a small smear of blood on the stairs that led to it. Inside, a pot of water, still warm from having been boiled, was on the stove. Stephanie was not in the cabin, in the tower, or in the immediate area. The authorities were notified that Stephanie was missing by 9 a.m. A massive multi-agency search for Stephanie was then launched. Volunteers, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, conservation officers, and search and rescue teams all helped with the effort. Thousands of kilometers of the surrounding area were searched on foot, by boat, from the air, and with all-terrain vehicles. No sign of Stephanie was found. The only items found to be missing from Stephanie's cabin were, in the words of authorities, an unusual watch as well as several pieces of bedding, 2 pillows and blue pillowcases, a burgundy bedsheet, and a Navajo-patterned bed cover. For days after Stephanie disappeared, authorities announced that they believed that Stephanie had been the victim of foul play. According to the RCMP, this decision was reached in part due to the forensic investigation of the scene, although the exact evidence that led to that conclusion could not be released to the public. Furthermore, they did not believe that Stephanie had been attacked by an animal or suffered from some sort of medical emergency that caused her to wander away. Abandoning her post would also have been highly out of her character. In January of 2018, Stephanie's disappearance was one of 3 cold cases presented at an RCMP press conference as an appeal for information in them. That August, just days before the 12th anniversary of her disappearance, over 100 people from numerous agencies were involved in a new multi-day search of the area around the Athabasca Watchtower. The new search was not the result of any new information in the case. It was carried out because the investigation into the open case is ongoing. Authorities also hoped that advances in GPS technology could help ensure that no potential search areas went unchecked during the search. Following Stephanie's disappearance, numerous changes were made to ensure the safety of the fire spotters who work out of the 128 fire watchtowers in Alberta and are the first to report approximately 1/3 of the between 160–1800 forest fires Alberta experiences annually. Self-defense classes are now required for them, and gates were installed at towers that can be reached from the road. Fire spotters now make more frequent radio check-ins with their supervisors and wear personal locator be-ins. They have better radios that have a panic button on them, and code words have been developed for fire spotters to covertly communicate that they are in danger when it's not safe to do so directly. New locks were installed on the cabins at the watchtowers, and the cabins were reinforced with steel doors and shatterproof glass in their windows. "We give Stephanie credit for all these improvements in the workplace," said Dennis Maliko of the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees in 2011. "Unfortunately, it takes an incident of this nature to raise this concern. Stephanie Stewart remains missing." Morgan Heimer was raised in Cody, Wyoming, graduating from Cody High School in 2011. He loved sports and outdoor activities and was highly skilled in many of them, including soccer, skiing, and rafting. He enjoyed teaching others how to participate in these activities as well. He was also passionate about seeing the world, traveling extensively, and participating in 3 enrichment voyages with semester at sea. In the summer of 2015, the 22-year-old was combining his interests by working as a guide for Tour West, a commercial rafting company taking groups on extended whitewater rafting trips. On June 2nd, he was 6 days into an 8-day trip down the Colorado River in Canyon National Park. That afternoon, Morgan facilitated an activity for the members of the tour group, directing them as they jumped off a small cliff into the water off of the main river near River Mile 213 near Pumpkin Springs. After the last person jumped, around 4 p.m., Morgan was speaking with his lead guide, discussing possibly taking some time off that afternoon. The lead guide then walked away to speak with a member of the tour group. When they turned around a moment later, Morgan was gone. They assumed that he had stepped away to take his break. The lead guide, as well as everyone else on the trip, became concerned when dinner came and went that evening with no sign of Morgan. They began searching the area for him on their own with no success. At 7:30, they used their satellite phone to call the National Park Service to report that Morgan was missing. Ground teams were launched to search the shoreline and helicopters performed the initial search of the river from the air. Missing persons flyers were distributed throughout the area and other river trips were briefed about the disappearance. 14 miles of the river and 4 miles along its shores were searched. No signs of Morgan were found in or near the river, and there were no indications that he had hiked out of the area. If Morgan did fall into the river, he would have been in a much better position than the average individual, as he was an exceptional swimmer. Furthermore, he was wearing a personal flotation device at the time of his disappearance. After 6 days, with no sign of Morgan and finding no clues to follow, the National Park Service scaled back the search for him, and the effort entered limited continuous mode. In 2019, Morgan's family and friends partnered with the Institute for Shipboard Education to create the Morgan Heimer Memorial Scholarship Fund. The scholarship will be awarded annually to a student from Montana, Colorado, or Wyoming who demonstrates financial need as well as a spirit of adventure, love of people, and desire to experience new cultures so that they may go on a semester at sea voyage, traveling and meeting people from around the world, as Morgan so enjoyed doing. Jerry Halbert was reported missing on August 4, 2003. It was believed at the time that he had walked from his home in Charleston, West Virginia, to a nearby bus station with plans to visit his son in Cambridge, Ohio, approximately 130 miles north of Charleston. He never arrived there. His family was immediately concerned as the 64-year-old was beginning to suffer from dementia. Little progress was made in the case over the years despite the best efforts of Jerry's family, whose efforts were largely focused on searching for him in Ohio, where he was believed to be traveling. Jerry's case would finally be solved thanks to the efforts of a volunteer. 17 years he went missing. Patty Williams Childress is a retired social worker who now devotes her time to investigating missing persons cases and unidentified remains through various volunteer organizations and websites, including the DNA Doe Project. In the summer of 2020, Who Are You Doe? A Facebook group dedicated to researching cases involving unidentified remains posted the story of a John Doe found in Kingsport, Tennessee in August of 2003. On August 11th, a woman had been riding her bicycle through Riverfront Park when she noticed something unusual in the Holston River, which police confirmed to be human remains. There was no identification found with them, just a bank envelope in the pocket of the pair of pants found with them containing $267. The remains were too badly decomposed due to their time in the water for them to be useful in their identification on their own. A clay model forensic rendering of the deceased man's face was commissioned to help with his identification. Various leads were followed up on over the ensuing years. A forensic drawing was also created in 2018. However, the man found in the river was unidentified 17 years later when his story and the forensic artistic renderings were shared in the Facebook group and attracted Patty's attention. Normally, Patty limited her research to within a 25-mile radius of where an unidentified person was found, but the bank envelope told her that she would need to expand her search. The envelope had been from BB&T Bank, which did not have any locations in Kingsport in 2003, meaning the man was not from the immediate area. She found Jerry's case through another site she was active with and informed police in Kingsport of similarities between him and their John Doe. They agreed that the remains could potentially be Jerry's and began investigating this lead. They then spoke with a relative of Jerry's back in West Virginia and obtained a DNA sample from them to compare to the DNA of their John Doe. In early August of 2020, near 17th anniversary of Jerry's disappearance, police announced that DNA testing had confirmed that the remains found in the Holston River belonged to Jerry Halbert. Jerry's daughter, Misty, told WSAZ News that she had been holding on to hope of finding her father alive. She was grateful, however, to finally have answers about what happened to her father. She contacted Patty Williams-Childress to personally express the gratitude she and her family feel for the work she did to finally bring resolution to the case. It is not known exactly what brought Jerry to Kingsport, which is in the opposite direction of where he was planning to go in Ohio, but his family believes that he must have gotten onto the wrong bus as a result of his dementia. Police do not believe that foul play is involved in the case. Saskatchewan, Canada. March 25, 2015, 6 a.m. A man walking near a landfill site on the southern edge of Saskatoon made an urgent 911 call. He had come across a young woman lying on the ground. She was cold to the touch, and marks were visible on her neck. Her black leather jacket had blood on the hood, and she was barefoot with a smashed watch. It was clear that a violent struggle had taken place. Authorities arrived quickly, but there were no signs of life, and she was declared dead at the scene. It was evident they were investigating a homicide. The only item found nearby was a dark blue belt with a large buckle. The area around her was otherwise empty and quiet. She had no identification on her, so the police released images of her clothing and distinctive tattoos, including a large lion on her back. It wasn't long before a teenager named Cheyenne called in. She was crying and said the tattoos matched those of her best friend, Britney Gargol. The two had been together the night before but had parted ways in the early hours, and Cheyenne hadn't seen her since. More calls confirmed the same name, and it was indeed Britney. 18-year-old Britney Gargol had lived in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan her whole life. Her family was large, and when her parents split when she was younger, they went on to create an even larger one. Britney now had 4 younger sisters who looked up to her a lot, as she had recently reconnected with her biological father after some years. They didn't skip a beat and were loving spending so much time together. Friends said she was outspoken, never one to hold back her opinions. She was adventurous and enjoyed snowboarding, boating, and camping. Britney was feisty with a great sense of humor and was never short of people that wanted to hang out with her. She was busy, having just started back at school, and had been saving money working 2 jobs. She wanted to finish school, go to college to study business, and then move into the hospitality industry. Authorities started piecing together the previous day. They already knew that she had been out in the evening, which narrowed down her time of death considerably. Britney's friend, Natasha, was the first to come forward, and the pair had been close for years. Natasha said Britney would come to her for advice, and when Natasha found out Britney had dropped out of school, she was the person that encouraged her to go back and get her grades. On March 24th, Natasha had lent her some money for gas and asked her what her plans were. Britney told her she was meeting up with a few friends and might go to a party. Natasha hugged her goodbye saying, "All right, girl, I'll see you soon." But she hadn't heard anything after that. The person she had been out drinking with, her best friend of many years, Cheyenne, was next to talk. The pair got close when Britney found out about Cheyenne's tumultuous childhood and adolescence, and became a big support for her. They were inseparable, spending most of their days together, and going out for drinks was something they did often. Their night began just after midnight, with Britney uploading a selfie of the two of them before they left. Cheyenne told police they had gone to several places together in Britney's car, starting off at Manchester's Brew Pub. Later, they went to a house party, then headed across town to the Colonial Pub and Grill. But Cheyenne said the house party was heavy, and after they left, the night was hazy. She did vaguely remember something happening in the Colonial Pub and Grill that she worried might be behind what had happened to her friend. Britney had started speaking to a random man at the bar, and the pair seemed to be hitting it off. Britney asked him for a lighter and invited him to have drinks with them. Before Cheyenne could get to know him, Britney and the man left. Britney didn't say where they were going, and Cheyenne didn't get the man's name. She didn't even see what direction they had left in, or if they were on foot or driving in Britney's car. All she could remember was that he was white, and it was around 4 a.m. For some reason, Britney had Cheyenne's phone, and Cheyenne had made her way back to visit her uncle, who corroborated her coming to see him by herself. Cheyenne couldn't offer up any more information, and what she had was blurry anyway. A few hours after she last saw her friend, a worried Cheyenne posted on Facebook, "Where are you? Haven't heard from you. Hope you made it home safe. Love you." Officers needed to find this mystery man, but they had little to go on. It is unconfirmed where Britney's car was found, but when it was covered in dust, dirt, dark marks on the side, and had long grass in the tires. Cheyenne's phone was in the car, seemingly confirming that Britney had taken it as she had left, and maybe she and the man had driven somewhere rather than walked. Detectives checked the footage from the Colonial Pub and Grill, but they could not see Cheyenne or Britney anywhere, and the bar had no recollection of them being there. However, it was a busy night and it was possible that Cheyenne's timings were off. As Cheyenne's phone was found in Britney's car, they hoped that the phone data could be analyzed to show other locations Britney had gone to that night and fill in the gaps that Cheyenne couldn't. Cheyenne's phone had pinged us at McDonald's at 4:30 a.m., but she had made no mention of this. So, did Britney go there after leaving the bar? Britney's autopsy results finally came back, and it confirmed, as they suspected, that she had been strangled to death. They now felt confident that the belt found near her body was the murder weapon. Detectives kept trying to piece together Cheyenne's story, but they had a bad feeling in the back of their minds. Something about it was very off. Although it was entirely possible she had got things confused and her timings were wrong because she was intoxicated, there was just nothing to indicate they were ever in the Colonial Pub and Grill, a place Cheyenne was adamant they were, and the same place Britney allegedly met this unknown mystery man. The months were passing by and it was now September 2015. Investigators were still in the same place that they were back in March. People were still in shock and couldn't believe this had happened. Many a tribute was pouring in, including a big one from Cheyenne. They decided to go back to talk to Cheyenne's uncle again, and he was far more evasive than last time. But after some pushing, he suddenly had more to say. He told police that Cheyenne had said the pair had met two people in the bar that morning and gone back to a motel with them. The only thing she told him was that they were black males, whereas before, she said Britney was talking to a white male. But she said she couldn't remember their names, what they were wearing, or where the motel was. She said at the motel they were all smoking marijuana and an argument allegedly broke out over some cocaine. Cheyenne went to the bathroom. When she came back, she found Britney dead on the bed with marks on her neck. She told her uncle that the two men had pulled a gun on her and forced her to cover up what they had done. Although they didn't believe the story for various reasons, Cheyenne was at least admitting she knew Britney had been killed before she called the police to identify her. She had put herself at the scene and spoke of the marks on her neck. Cheyenne had racked up a long list of convictions and had over 50 since the age of 12. At this point, she was already in custody for another crime, so they could easily question her. The once so helpful and concerned friend that was happy to talk was suddenly quiet, uncooperative, and evasive. And when she didn't give them a thing, they had no choice but to leave. It was now over a year later and police were hitting a wall. They felt they had exhausted every witness and lead. Most CCTV had long since expired and didn't tell them anything anyway. And no one had anything else to offer up. They still only had one person of interest, Cheyenne. Investigators had been going through Britney and Cheyenne's social media accounts with a fine-tooth comb, wondering if something was staring them in the face. A comment buried away or a message they hadn't seen. And then finally they spotted something huge. In the tribute post Cheyenne had uploaded, the top half of the girls' outfits could clearly be seen. They realized that Cheyenne was wearing a belt that they recognized all too well. It was the same belt found by Britney's body and what they now believed to be the murder weapon. The marks around her neck matched the weave of the belt exactly, and police said the marks on the car were consistent with coming from the belt. With this fresh information, the belt was sent for more thorough DNA testing. Experts found Cheyenne and Britney's DNA on it. Authorities couldn't believe it, recognizing that if the photo had been taken at even a slightly different angle, this key piece of evidence would likely never have been linked to Cheyenne. It was still a complex case to build. They had no motive and Cheyenne wasn't giving them anything. Months became years, and it was now almost 2 years since Britney had died. Finally, they got a tip from someone who hadn't yet spoken up. A friend of Cheyenne's had turned up at Britney's parents' house with a shocking story. She said that Cheyenne had come to her house that very morning sometime after 5 a.m. She was very drunk and sobbing, and the friend described it as an alcohol-fueled rant. Cheyenne said that she and Britney had gotten into what she described as a heated argument, something over a cell phone, but she didn't elaborate, hysterically crying and shaking. Cheyenne said she had hit and choked Britney to death with her belt. She pointed to something outside, and as the friend looked out, she saw Britney's car parked up with Britney slumped against the window in the passenger seat, bleeding. Cheyenne didn't speak any more about the fight, what had caused it, or how it had escalated, but she made no mention of anyone else being there or a motel. Her friend was so shaken up she told Cheyenne to leave immediately, and she got back in the car and drunkenly sped off. But once Cheyenne sobered up the next morning, the friend said she had claimed she couldn't remember anything that had happened that night and had seemingly forgotten everything. The friend were too scared to report this to the police, but as time ticked by, they decided to give the information to the family. Cheyenne's uncle also later admitted she had asked him to go along with her story, and he had given her several false alibis. Police said that she had manipulated the story, made up random people, used her uncle, posted lies to Facebook, and spent 2 years taking no responsibility. If she felt as bad as she said over what she had done, she could have taken Britney to hospital. Instead, she left her to die. In March 2017, Cheyenne Antoine was charged with second-degree murder and causing indignity to a body. With all the evidence against her, Cheyenne told them the same story she had told her friend that early morning. They were drinking and smoking a lot, and Cheyenne said after the house party is where her memory started to go. She said she vaguely remembered going to a McDonald's where the pair started arguing. They left and started walking when Britney grabbed Cheyenne's phone. Cheyenne said she couldn't really remember how it had happened, but she remembered being livid and snapping. Everything went hazy and suddenly Britney was unconscious on the ground. At the age of 21, she finally appeared in court and faced Britney's family for the first time. Cheyenne buried her head in her hands, crying and not looking at anyone. Under Canadian law, second-degree murder is generally a deliberate killing that occurs without planning, but does not fall under any of the categories of first-degree murder. It can still carry a hefty sentence, however, with the minimum term starting at life in prison with 10 years to serve. Manslaughter is homicide committed without intent. Although there may have been an intention to cause harm, this carries no minimum sentence. Knowing this, Cheyenne's legal team announced that she was cutting a deal. She pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter, rather than go through a trial for second-degree murder. She said she would take responsibility for Britney's death, but had no memory of it. Therefore, manslaughter was appropriate. Through her lawyer, she said, "I will never forgive myself. Nothing I say or do will ever bring her back. I am very, very sorry. It shouldn't have ever happened." Her lawyer asked for sympathy considering the years of trauma her clients had gone through. She didn't really have a relationship with her parents, had lost her mother young, and had a criminal record from the age of just 12 years old, racking up 54 convictions by the age of 19. Her memories of her parents were of them abusing drugs to escape the trauma that they had experienced as a result of Canada's infamous residential school system. Cheyenne had moved in with foster parents who had physically and sexually abused her, and her lawyer said she was sexually assaulted a month prior to Britney's murder, which had significantly increased her drug and alcohol use. She was now using much harder substances like meth. But people said it had to be noted that, as awful as everything she had suffered through was, Britney was somebody that had been there for her through thick and thin, helping her manage her feelings, regulate her emotions, and always being a shoulder to cry on. Britney had been the one constant and support system in her life, the one person she always knew she could turn to. She would have done anything for her. She knows the family would like an explanation, a reason, but unfortunately she can't provide that, Cheyenne's lawyer said. Police and prosecutors say Cheyenne mentioned a cell phone potentially being the cause of the fight, but they know little else. Cheyenne has never said anything else about it, and whether she remembers or not, has blocked it out, or is intentionally keeping quiet, is still unknown. It will likely always be this way. 21-year-old Cheyenne was later sentenced to 7 years in prison, with a likely release date of 2024 or 2025. The judge said she needed to work a program in prison to help her with her addiction and anger. Honor your friend by becoming a positive, productive woman. You owe it to her to persevere, she said. There are still so many questions about what happened that night and why it ever did. One person claims they can't remember and the other can't talk at all. Britney's aunt described the pain of losing a niece as profoundly dark and intense. And Christy, her stepmother, said Britney's little sister feels guilty if a day goes by where she doesn't think about Britney. She was just 5 years old at the time of her death and says she's worried that if she doesn't think about her, it means she's forgetting her. Britney's father, Everett, said, "I feel so much anger and sadness about how short her life was. My life changed forever. I miss her so much." The day before she was killed, he was supposed to help fix something with her car, but he couldn't make it back in time. He said he thinks of this every day, knowing it could have been just one last time to hug her. And he was robbed of that. On the afternoon of January 26, 1996, Dave Schultz was in his Toyota Tercel, working on the radio while parked in the driveway of his home in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. He would soon have to stop, as he was scheduled to pick up his 2 children, 9-year-old Alexander and 6-year-old Danielle, from school that day. To make sure he didn't forget, Dave had written PU Kids on his hand. Dave was a familiar presence at Culbertson Elementary School, where his children were students. He often visited the school to have lunch with them and, as an Olympic gold medalist in wrestling 1984, he regularly gave talks about sportsmanship and the importance of hard work. He would bring his gold medal with him and would go around placing it around the neck of each of the students he was speaking to after his talks. Around 3 p.m., a Lincoln Town car pulled up to the house. Dave called out, "Hi, Coach," to the driver. "Do you have a problem with me?" was the driver's response. Without giving Dave a chance to answer, the driver reached out his window and shot him with a revolver. Dave's wife, Nancy, had been in their living room when she heard the shot. She heard a second shot before she reached her front door. She got outside just in time to see her husband be shot for a 3rd time as he lay prone on the ground. The gunman pointed his gun at Nancy, so she ducked back inside and called 911. The gunman sped off and Nancy ran back outside to Dave. When she turned him back over, Dave was still breathing and she kissed his forehead. He stopped breathing there on the ground outside of his home. He was formally declared dead after he was taken to Mercy Haverford Hospital just after 3:30. Dave was just 36 years old. The man who shot Dave was 57-year-old John Eleuthère DuPont, the great-great-grandson of Eleuthère Irene DuPont, the founder of what had been a gunpowder mill but expanded into one of the largest chemical companies in the world. E.I. DuPont d'Estimores and Company eventually developed numerous widely used polymers such as Lycra, neoprene, and Teflon. The DuPonts were one of America's wealthiest and most well-known families. In 1987, John's personal net worth was estimated to be around $200 million. John was raised at Lecceter Hall, a massive mansion built on 600 acres of land purchased by his maternal grandfather as a wedding present for John's parents. John's paternal grandfather had built the mansion for them and modeled it after Montpelier, the home of President James Madison, which he himself had acquired in 1901. Lecceter Hall Farm, as the entire estate would be known, acquired more property over the years, eventually encompassing more than 800 acres in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, west of Philadelphia. John's upbringing was one of extreme privilege, but also one of extreme isolation and little socialization. His parents divorced when he was just a toddler, and his father had little to do with John after he remarried. John told friends that he had to make an appointment to see his father and told the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1986 that he had spent his life searching for a father figure. John was much younger than his siblings, who had all married and moved out of the family home by the time he was school-aged, and he interacted mainly with his mother and their domestic servants. He ate meals in his room with a maid until he was 13. John was educated at the Haverford School, where he was voted both laziest and most likely to succeed. He enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania after his 1957 graduation from the Haverford School. However, he left before finishing his first year of study. He then went on to the University of Miami, where he earned a degree in marine biology. By this time, John had become obsessed with the idea of competing at the Olympics in swimming. While he was a strong enough swimmer to make the varsity swimming team in college, he was by no means skilled enough to go to the Olympics. He was eventually advised that his best chance of competing in the games would be to try to qualify in the modern pentathlon, which consists of running, swimming, shooting, fencing, and horseback riding. He had a 15-meter pool and a shooting range installed at Lecceter Hall for his training, and commissioned a mosaic showing him competing in each of the 5 events made out of tiles imported from Italy. John found some measure of success as a pentathlete, placing first in the Australian Championship in 1965. However, when he sought to qualify for the 1968 Olympics, he came in second to last at the trials. Thanks to his financial contributions to the sport, he remained involved in the community though and was made the manager of the 1976 Olympic pentathlon team. John was similarly able to use his financial resources to insert himself into the athletics program at Villanova University. He offered the university $5 million to be used to construct a new basketball arena and establish a wrestling program. The arena would have to be named after him, and he would need to be the new wrestling team's head coach. The DuPont Pavilion opened in 1986, and John was allowed to run the new wrestling program. The program only survived for 2 seasons, however. John would allow the students on the team to stay at his estate and would fly them on his private jet. The university was concerned that this behavior could be viewed as a violation of the National Collegiate Athletic Association regulations about paying or giving gifts to student athletes, which could endanger their entire athletic program. Furthermore, John's management of the team and his relationships with the coaching staff have become problematic. The clearest example of this came in December of 1988, when John was sued by one of his former assistant coaches at Villanova, Andre Metzger. Andre alleged in the suit that he had been fired from his position after he refused John DuPont's sexual advances. He claimed that in March, John had asked him to leave his wife and children to move in with him, offering to give Andre's wife the home they had been living in and large sums of money in exchange. Andre refused and was fired 2 months later. John claimed that he had fired Andre because he had discouraged 2 very promising high school wrestlers from attending Villanova. Both of the students said that Andre had done no such thing. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court. 1988 was not only a year of upheaval for John because of the end of the wrestling program at Villanova, but because his mother, Jean, passed away that same year. He and his mother had been exceptionally close, and she was the only relative who was really a part of his life. Jean's death left a void in John's life, but it also freed him to fill that void by becoming more involved with wrestling. Jean had not approved of her son's interest in the sport, viewing it as an activity for ruffians, not men of high society like her son. Despite his disappointment with the failure of the Villanova program, John remained passionate about wrestling, and his involvement in the sport only increased in the absence of his disapproving mother. Following his mother's death, John changed the name of the family estate from Lecceter Hall Farms to Foxcatcher Farm in honor of the stables his father had owned in the 1920s. He had previously sponsored swimmers and pentathletes to train at the estate, but those were minor efforts compared to the investment he made in wrestling. He built a state-of-the-art 14,000-square-foot wrestling training center, the Foxcatcher National Training Center, on his property and created a private wrestling club, Team Foxcatcher, that ultimately brought many of the most talented wrestlers of the time to Pennsylvania. In the late 1980s, the American wrestling program consistently lagged behind that of the Soviet Union. Wrestlers there had far more support than their counterparts in the United States, making it possible for them to have longer careers and dedicate more time to their training. While there were American wrestlers who did win international tournaments and Olympic medals, they normally could only remain active in the sport for a few years before financial considerations forced them to focus on careers rather than continuing their training. As such, at any given time, there were far fewer high-level wrestlers in America compared to the Soviet Union. John DuPont planned to use his wealth and his new private training center to change that. Between 1987 and 1995, he gave more than $3 million to USA Wrestling, the sport's governing national agency in the United States. He paid the wrestlers who came to train at his facility and be a part of Team Foxcatcher a stipend of up to $1,000 a month and offered year-round housing to several of them in the smaller houses on his estate. The early days of Team Foxcatcher have been described as a sports utopia. Wrestlers trained and worked as coaches, able to focus on the sport they loved free of the financial considerations that previously restricted them. John DuPont became close with several of the wrestlers and their families. He flew with the team to tournaments on his private jet. The wrestlers who trained at Foxcatcher did always think that something was not quite right with John DuPont, however. In the beginning, he seemed to just be eccentric, and his behavior was seen as odd but amusing. As the years passed, however, his behavior became more and more concerning. He went from being just a strange character to a man who displayed an unusual amount of paranoia. Eventually, his actions seemed to be motivated by complete delusions. John thought that there were mechanical trees that traveled around his estate, and he installed barbed wire in his walls because he believed intruders were moving inside of them. He argued that tooth marks left by horses in his barn were in fact messages from Martians. He had a large section of his property excavated, trying to find secret tunnels he was sure ran under his mansion. He started casually carrying firearms around the farm, out of fear that he was being preyed upon. He became obsessed with the idea that the farm had been infiltrated with spies working against him. John shot the geese living in a pond on his property because he claimed they had been casting spells on him. He ordered the removal of the treadmills in the training facility because he thought the timing devices inside of them were sending him backwards through time. John eventually developed an irrational dislike of the color black because of its association with death. He forbade people working on the farm from wearing black clothing, made wrestlers get rid of their black vehicles, and sold all of his black horses. Eventually, he felt the need to rid Foxcatcher Farm of black people as well, expelling the African-American wrestlers from his program. One of these wrestlers was Kevin Jackson, who had just won a gold medal at the most recent Olympics and trained part-time at the facility on Foxcatcher Farm. As DuPont became increasingly delusional and paranoid, the wrestlers who made up Team Foxcatcher had an increasingly difficult time interacting with him, and several of them raised concerns about their safety at the farm. One of the few wrestlers who remained loyal to John and was willing to mediate the conflicts his increasingly troublesome behavior inevitably created was Dave Schultz. Dave's continued commitment to John and to Team Foxcatcher was important, in part because his talent as a wrestler and as a coach was what drew many wrestlers to the program. More importantly, he was highly respected amongst wrestlers as a man, not just as an athlete. Relationships were highly important to Dave, and he cultivated them around the world with men he was supposed to view as rivals. Five-time world champion Bruce Baumgartner described Dave as the man who spoke words in 50 languages because he made every effort to try to communicate with those he met at the various international tournaments he attended throughout his career. Dave also became fluent in Russian. He had initially begun learning the language so he could try to overhear advice from Russian coaches, considered to be the top in their field. While Russian-speaking wrestlers were some of Dave's stiffest competition on the international circuit, he had a great deal of respect for them. Rather than viewing them as rivals, he viewed them as fellow sportsmen who shared his passion for wrestling. Dave's ability to make friends from around the world played a role in one of the potential motives that has been suggested for his murder. Dave was very close friends with Valentin Yordanov, a Bulgarian wrestler who came to Foxcatcher Farm in 1990. Valentin and his family shared the house on Foxcatcher Farm. Dave would ultimately be killed outside of with the Schultz family. Dave having a good relationship with another wrestler would not normally be a cause of concern for any reason, but John DuPont had developed a fixation on Valentin. John became convinced that he was, in fact, of Bulgarian descent despite having a well-documented family tree that said otherwise. He claimed that their shared Bulgarian heritage gave him and Valentin a special relationship. He may have viewed Dave's friendship with Valentin as a threat to his perceived unique relationship with him. Ultimately, we do not know the exact motive behind John DuPont murdering one of his star athletes and most loyal coaches. John may have viewed Dave's efforts to keep the peace as efforts against him. By late 1995, John's behavior had become even more erratic, and Dave had to work harder to mediate conflicts on the farm. These actions, while technically done to help John, could have been construed by John's increasingly paranoid mind as Dave plotting against him. Dave was an honest man who would not lie to John to reinforce his delusions. By not blindly agreeing with whatever John said or thought, Dave may have made himself out to be an adversary in John's mind. The worse John's behavior became, the more Dave had to work to keep the peace, and the more John may have thought he was being attacked. The more Dave did to help John, the more John viewed him as an enemy. Some of John's past eccentric behavior had a violent undertone. He drove around the farm in a vehicle, he made jokes about violence, and he eventually began carrying firearms around with him during day-to-day activities. Some of the wrestlers on Team Foxcatcher were becoming concerned for their safety. Several events in the final months of 1995 indicated that John may have in fact been becoming truly dangerous and may have played a part in John's decision to kill Dave Schultz. One day in October of 1995, wrestler Dan Shade was lifting weights in the training center when John DuPont came in with a machine gun. John pressed the gun into Dan's chest and told him to get off his farm. Dan was able to talk John down and get out of the confrontation unharmed. He did the Newtown Square police about the incident, but the officer he spoke with's response was to simply say, "Well, I've known John a long time. He's always been a little different." John did have a long-standing relationship with the Newtown Square Police Department, even serving as a volunteer with them in the 1970s. He had donated radios and bulletproof vests to them and allowed them to use his shooting range. His involvement with the department had decreased as his involvement with wrestling increased, but police officers continued to hunt on Foxcatcher Farm every year. Police took no action about the incident in the weight room, but would later claim that this was not because of John DuPont's relationship with the department, but because Dan Shade had just spoken with an officer and not filed a formal police report. Dave Schultz became involved in the situation after he allowed Dan to park his van outside his house while Dan made preparations to move. This angered John, who seems to have believed that Dave was taking Dan's side over his. John later showed up at the Schultz home, visibly intoxicated and carrying a gun. Reports of John abusing alcohol and cocaine go back to at least the 1980s, and the substances were tied to other threats and acts of violence allegedly made by John. In the years following his mother's death, his substance abuse reportedly increased. He may have started abusing pills in addition to the cocaine, and he would regularly show up to events with alcohol on his breath. John did not injure anyone other than himself that night because he toppled over and hit his head shortly after arriving at the house. Dave and Nancy called a doctor who tended to John's injuries. The following day, someone made a passing comment to John about how he looked like he had been hit in the head with a baseball bat when they saw his injury from the fall. John then decided that he had sustained the wound from Dan Shade attacking him with a baseball bat rather than from him falling over drunk. He called the Newtown Square Police Department to file charges against Dan, and they responded to the farm. Dave Schultz had to explain to the police what had actually happened that night and assure them that Dan Shade had not even been present, much less involved, in the incident. Dave's statement to police, in which he recounts the version of events that occurred in reality rather than in the version John DuPont declared to be true, was included in the police file about the incident that John obtained from the Newtown Square Police Department. Before he left Foxcatcher Farm, Dan Shade warned Dave that he needed to leave as well because he and his family were not safe there. Dave still felt as though John would not actually physically harm anyone. Even his dedication to John was starting to wane, however. Dave hoped to make it to the 1996 Olympics, and so he remained at Foxcatcher Farm to train and coach other wrestlers who were preparing for the Olympic trials. He had decided to leave Team Foxcatcher after the Olympic Games, however. He was going to take his family back to his hometown of Palo Alto, California, where he had accepted a coaching job at Stanford. Dave reportedly told John of his plans to leave Foxcatcher Farm and return to California a few days prior to his murder. John's delusional mind may have viewed Dave's decision to leave as an attack against him and his program, combined with his perception that Dave was working against him, which had been reinforced by Dave's role in his feud with Dan Shade. This decision may have justified killing Dave in John's paranoid mind. After shooting Dave, John drove back to his mansion and retreated inside. Law enforcement was quick to respond to the farm, but they could not quickly apprehend John DuPont. The Newtown Square Police Department knew that a portion of the mansion had been reinforced as an impenetrable safe room during the Cold War, and that John kept firearms inside the home. There were also concerns based on John's increasing paranoia that he had booby-trapped parts of the mansion. More than 75 law enforcement professionals, including 30 members of the SWAT team, were outside of the mansion for a standoff that dragged on for 2 days. They were able to communicate with John over the phone at times, and during those conversations, he referred to himself as the Dalai Lama and ordered everyone off of his holy land. He spoke to his attorney several times but refused to surrender to police. The heat was cut off to the mansion in an effort to get John to come out. John did not appear to understand that his heat was turned off intentionally. On January 28th, he asked over the phone to be allowed to go outside to try to fix his boilers, which were not inside the main house. The authorities agreed, and after John walked outside, he was apprehended and taken into custody. He was dressed in a sweatshirt, bearing Bulgarian flags. Why exactly John DuPont decided to kill Dave Schultz that day is not known. What we do know is that John DuPont shot Dave Schultz in front of 2 witnesses, Nancy Schultz and John's own security consultant, who had been in the car with John when he fired all 3 shots. He had been unaware of John's plans when they got into the car that afternoon. As such, John's defense team did not try to dispute the events of January 26, 1996, or try to argue that he had not shot Dave Schultz. They did argue, however, that John was not guilty of murder. John went to trial for Dave's murder on January 21, 1997, almost exactly a year after Dave's murder, after his lawyers entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity to the charge. John had initially been found incompetent to stand trial in September of 1996 and sent for treatment of paranoid schizophrenia at Norristown State Hospital. In December of 1996, after John had undergone 2 months of treatment with antipsychotic drugs, the decision was reversed and he was found competent to stand trial. Given John's long history of bizarre and delusional behavior, which was witnessed by dozens of people, it would be easy to write him off as insane. The defense called present and former employees of Foxcatcher Farm to testify about all of the paranoid and seemingly irrational actions of John's that they had witnessed over the years. They also called 4 psychiatrists at the trial who supported the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. However, legally, suffering from a mental health condition does not automatically mean that a person is insane or absolve them of culpability for their actions. While John's lawyers presented overwhelming evidence supporting the notion that John was mentally ill, their legal obligation was to prove that he was insane. In order to prove that, they would have to demonstrate that John did not understand killing Dave was wrong at the moment he shot him. The defense's argument was that John held the irrational belief that Dave was part of an international conspiracy working against him, and that he was justified in killing him because it was an act of self-defense. Prosecution, however, while acknowledging that John DuPont was clearly suffering from mental illness, also held that he did understand that shooting Dave Schultz was wrong. He did not commit the murder because he was afraid of Dave. He committed it because he was growing resentful of him. He was guilty of first-degree murder because the crime was premeditated. The 2 psychiatrists who testified for the prosecution agreed that DuPont was mentally ill, but that he understood that killing Dave was wrong. Prosecutors also pointed to John's actions after he committed the murder to show that he knew what he had done was wrong. They claimed that the fact that John would not surrender to police and asked for his lawyer over 100 times during the 2-day standoff showed that he could comprehend that shooting Dave was wrong. The jury deliberated for 7 days after hearing weeks of testimony. As the days went by without a verdict, concerns that the trial would end in a hung jury increased. The jurors had returned to the courtroom 3 separate times to have their instructions repeated to them over the course of those 7 days. They appeared to be having trouble determining the differences between the 3 possible verdicts they could return if they rejected the insanity defense: first-degree murder, third-degree murder, or voluntary manslaughter. On the 7th day of deliberations, the jurors could be heard yelling at each other from outside the room where they were deliberating. However, they were able to come to a final decision later that day. At 5:09 p.m., on February 25, 1997, the jury announced their verdict. They found John DuPont guilty of third-degree murder but mentally ill. Their finding that he was mentally ill meant that they had rejected the defense's claim that John was legally insane at the time of the murder and still held him legally responsible for it, but allowed the judge to make a determination as to whether John should continue to be held at a psychiatric facility. While he awaited his sentencing, John was returned to Norristown State Hospital. The defense vowed to fight for the minimum sentence of 5.5 to 11 years, and the prosecution vowed to seek the maximum sentence allowed of 40 years in prison. John DuPont was ultimately sentenced to 13 to 30 years in prison. His lawyers filed multiple unsuccessful appeals after his conviction. On the morning of December 9, 2010, John was found unresponsive in his cell at Laurel Highlands State Correctional Institution. He was taken to Somerset Community Hospital, where he was declared dead. He had been suffering from severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He was 72. In accordance with the instructions in his will, he was buried in his red Foxcatcher wrestling singlet. John's will, written 3 months before his death, left 80% of his estate to Valentin Yordanov, his wife, and various members of their family. Several of John's nieces and nephews filed various legal challenges to the will, arguing that their uncle had not been of sound mind when the will was created and that Wellington and his family had exerted undue influence over him during their visits with him. The legal battle went on for 2 years. The will was upheld, with a judge arguing that the relatives who were challenging the will had not been harmed by its enforcement, as they had not been named in the 5 previous iterations of John's will either. Foxcatcher Farm was sold off in several sections. 400 acres of it, including the site of the 90-year-old family mansion, was sold to a real estate developer. It is currently being developed into a luxury community named Lecedar in honor of the original name of the farm. 449 new luxury townhomes and houses are planned for the property. The mansion was torn down in 2013. The only major structure remaining from Foxcatcher Farms is an old barn, which was refurbished and turned into the community's clubhouse. 2 months after Dave's murder, Nancy Schultz established the Dave Schultz Wrestling Club. The club sponsored 20 former Foxcatcher wrestlers training for the 1996 Olympics who no longer wanted to be financially dependent on John DuPont. The club supported wrestlers and their training until 2005. Nancy also worked with USA Wrestling to establish the Dave Schultz Memorial International Tournament, which is held at the United States Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, Colorado every year, and keeps alive Dave's legacy of athletic excellence, as well as his dedication to sportsmanship and friendship, not limited by differences in languages or nationalities. Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, is a vibrant and bustling area, rich in culture, with historic buildings, theaters, exhibitions, occasional festivals, charming places to dine, and numerous shopping destinations. However, it also has a quieter side, with serene nature trails, peaceful rivers for boating, swimming, and fishing, and several large state parks nearby. The locals often describe a strong sense of community, where everyone supports one another. This case takes us to Jefferson Parish in 2022, home to 54-year-old Yolanda Dillian. Born and raised in New Orleans, Yolanda had spent her entire life there, and often said she could never grow tired of it. She had a prominent presence in the local community and was always involved in various activities. Yolanda worked as a budget analyst for the New Orleans Police Department for around 10 years. It was a demanding and high-pressure job, but she found fulfillment in it, and her colleagues held her in high regard. They described her as quiet and humble, someone that did great work for the department and kept everything organized, but was never able to mention it or make anything about herself. They said although Yolanda was quieter, she had a cheeky sense of humor and was always positive, someone they felt comfortable to talk to and share their problems with. Yolanda's always optimistic nature was massively challenged when she was faced with the awful diagnosis of breast cancer. Ever the fighter, she took it all in her stride, and everyone was elated when she got the news that she had beaten it. Yolanda took this as a sign to throw herself into more than ever, and make sure she was doing everything she wanted to do and helping everyone she could. Having already got her bachelor's and master's in sociology, she was now working towards a PhD in it as well. She lived and cared for her mother, 83-year-old Edna, who was also sadly battling cancer. Yolanda was an only child, and after she lost her father, Luther, she and Edna grew closer than ever. Caring for anyone is challenging, but Yolanda said she wouldn't have it any other way. However, with medical and school bills and debt mounting up, Yolanda needed a bit more money to make sure things were taken care of. She was strong in her faith and was a devoted church volunteer at St. Paul the Apostle Church, having been going there since she was a child. Another reason she wanted a bit of extra cash was to buy all the children there some Christmas presents. Edna said her daughter didn't have children of her own, but was a big kid at heart and loved spoiling the little ones at the church whenever she was there. Even though Yolanda had little time in her day, she decided she would start driving for Uber and Uber Eats to make up the extra money. Not wanting to worry her mother, she only told her half the story. She admitted to picking up and dropping off food, but knew if she said she was picking up passengers, Edna would worry. Her pastor said this was typical Yolanda, always asking others if they wanted help, but never wanting to bother anyone with her own stresses. She just kept it all to herself, and you would never know anything was wrong. With less than a couple of weeks before Christmas, she had started collecting gift bags for the children and was slowly filling them up. And on December 8th, with a few hours spare, she picked up a shift with Uber. December 8th, 3:36 p.m. An employee at a local travel lodge in Harvey had seen something near the parking lot, which instantly caught their attention. There were two people in the car, and the person in the back was leaning over and into the person in the driver's seat. It looked so odd, in fact, that the employee tentatively walked over to see if everything was okay, but it wasn't. As they got closer, they could see a female in the driver's seat and a young man in the back. The woman was vomiting blood and choking. The man in the back then jumped out of the car, ignoring the employee who was running back and forth into the building, shouting at him to find out what was going on. The man pulled out his phone and started filming the car and the woman, a video he swiftly uploaded to Facebook. The employee was horrified and they called 911. They watched as the man walked away like nothing had happened. More people were now running over to try and help, but it was a really violent and gory scene. When authorities got there, they quickly realized that the driver was none other than Yolanda. She was slumped in her car with numerous stab wounds to her neck and back. She had lost a huge amount of blood and was barely holding on. They rushed her to the nearby hospital and shut the area off. Fortunately, inside the car they found her phone. Investigators contacted Uber, trying to find out who she had last picked up and the journey she had taken. They needed to get the information quickly, but Uber said that until the fare had officially been closed on her end, as she was the driver, they couldn't give them anything. As frustrated officers continued trying to bypass the app and get through to Uber, Yolanda, who was now in hospital, was fighting for her life. But that fight soon came to an end. Her injuries were just too severe, and Yolanda Dillian died shortly after arriving. Good afternoon. I'm Net Gatto, and I'm Lauren McCoy. An Uber driver who was also an NOPD employee is murdered outside a Jefferson Parish hotel. Detectives back at the travel lodge finally managed to work out how to close the trip. And with this, they got a name, Brandon Jacobs. They contacted Uber for more information on his accounts and to get his phone number. They then started circulating the information, hoping to track where he had gone. He was likely still armed and clearly very dangerous. The phone data was showing them that Brandon was still nearby, but they didn't realize just how close he actually was. To their shock, he was a guest at the very travel lodge he had just murdered Yolanda outside of. And what no one realized was that as they were out in the streets trying to find him, as soon as he stabbed Yolanda, he actually walked around the front and back up to his room. Just a couple of hours later, he came back down to smoke. As he lit up a cigarette outside, officers made their move and Brandon Jacobs was placed in handcuffs. He was being held without bond and police didn't have to interview him for long before he started talking. He admitted to everything and said it was actually completely planned out. Brandon had checked in a few days prior. He had been working in Seattle for the past 7 years as a software developer for Microsoft, but had recently taken leave and got on to benefits. It is unconfirmed why he did this, but after he took leave, he started moving around a lot. From Seattle, Washington, all the way through to New Orleans, where he was now. That morning, he said he had woken up and quite simply decided he was going to kill someone. He started Googling knives online and knife stores in the area. He then proceeded to order an Uber that took him to a store that sold knives. He told police that he had debated on killing this Uber driver but realized he wouldn't be able to get back to the travel lodge. So he changed his plan. The driver dropped him off at the store where Brandon bought 2 knives and a sweatshirt. He used the sweatshirt to conceal the knives and ordered his second Uber of the day, set to drop him back at the motel. And this Uber driver would be Yolanda. How did you pick her? Detectives asked the 29-year-old. I didn't pick her. Uber picked her, he coldly said. The sheriff Joseph La Pinto said there was no rhyme, reason, or motive for his actions. It was just mindless violence. He said the interview was so shocking and void of emotion. Officers were searching for words, but there really were none. How could this have happened to someone like Yolanda, one of their own? Investigators have no idea about the ins and outs of what happened in the car or if any words were exchanged. But given where she was parked up and was found, they believe the second she pulled up to complete the trip, he just lunged over and stabbed her in the neck. Experts say this would have incapacitated her immediately. Unbelievably, the video Brandon filmed was available on Facebook until the police contacted the social media company asking that it be taken down. As the story started coming out, Edna gave a heartbreaking statement. Yolanda's cousin said, "Your faith has to pull you through," and understanding that it was her time and the Lord wanted to call her home. Yolanda was dearly loved by so many, and people were doing everything they could to help and support Edna during this time. The outpouring of grief and sadness was just as strong as the rage that everyone felt. Actor Wendell Pierce from The Wire urged people to remember Yolanda, saying they had attended church together for years and that she had a heart of gold. A fundraiser was set up raising over $17,000. People say she wouldn't have had any idea how much she had impacted and touched so many lives, and seeing so much love would have overwhelmed her. Uber themselves even released a statement saying, "We are extremely disturbed by this senseless attack. Our thoughts are with Yolanda's family, and we are reaching out to offer them condolences and support. We are actively working with the police on their investigation." Other drivers that worked with companies like Uber, amongst others, spoke out about their fears and feelings too, especially with driving at night. But Uber said it was committed to their drivers' safety and highlighted all of their safety features. These include an emergency button that, when activated, sends details to authorities, and a requirement that riders using anonymous payment forms upload images of government IDs. A week before Christmas, Yolanda Dillian was laid to rest. Many were expecting a first-degree murder charge to be brought Brandon based on his own admission of premeditation. But despite this, a grand jury would indict the 29-year-old on charges of second-degree murder. Months would pass, and because he was in and out of interviews and assessments about his mental state, he had not yet been arraigned. After much back and forth, in May 2023, it was announced that Brandon Jacobs was found not competent to stand trial. A series of court-appointed experts who had been assessing Brandon handed a report over to the judge, who decided he should be transferred from prison to a psychiatric hospital for further evaluation. How long this will take and what the outcome will be is anyone's guess. But it definitely will not be a quick process. For the friends and family of Yolanda, it was a huge blow, and they are now in limbo waiting for answers. Yolanda Dillian was a fighter and an inspiration. She was a hard worker and someone whose optimism couldn't be shaken, even when faced with such difficult challenges. Her family hoped that everyone remembers her for her strength and her selflessness. Someone who, although she didn't realize it, brought so much to so many. In 1974, 18-year-old Sabrina Cain lived in Belleville, Illinois, with her mother, Laureen, and her stepfather, Fred Rourke, an officer with the Belleville Police Department. After graduating from Belleville West High School in 1973, Sabrina began working full-time at Midwest Savings and Loan and part-time at a Kmart grocery in the evenings. In early December 1973, Sabrina's boyfriend at the time, Bob Deller, who worked with her at Kmart, noticed she had become increasingly anxious. Though she wouldn't tell him what was bothering her, her mood seemed to improve by Christmas. However, her improved spirits were short-lived, and by February 1974, she was so distressed about her home life that she wanted to move out of her mother's and stepfather's house. On the afternoon of February 3rd, Sabrina asked Bob to drive her to a friend's house in O'Fallon, Illinois. She confided that she wanted to leave home because of her stepfather's behavior. Once she arrived, she called her mother. Laureen Rourke promised to help Sabrina find an apartment and move out if she came home. Sabrina agreed to return. Laureen advised her to ask her friend Patty Linton for a ride, as her stepfather would be angry if Bob brought her back. Fred Rourke did not permit his adult stepdaughter to date. Sabrina called Patty, who agreed to give her a ride. Bob and Sabrina drove to a park, where they met Patty and her husband Kurt, who then drove Sabrina back to her home. The following day, when Bob saw Sabrina at Kmart, she was even more determined to leave home. She told Bob that she was going to wait until her stepfather was not home and then move all of her clothes out of the house. Bob offered to let her borrow his car to do so, but she declined his offer. Bob saw Sabrina again around 10:30 in the morning on February 5th, again at the Kmart, when she came in specifically to speak with him. She was now getting even more support from Patty and Kurt Linton. After Patty got off work that day, she was going to look at apartments with Sabrina, and Sabrina would be spending the night at her apartment rather than go back to the house. She was so determined to leave. Sabrina told Bob that she would call him around 6 o'clock that evening. She never did. Sabrina had been driven to the Kmart to see Bob by Kurt Linton. He had picked her up at a shopping center a mile from her home after she called him for a ride. She had walked over to see Patty at her job at the Bank of Belleville at 9:30 that morning to ask if she could stay at her apartment while she looked for one of her own. Patty agreed after reminding Sabrina that she would have to sleep on the floor. This did not bother Sabrina, who just wanted to be out of her mother and stepfather's house. Sabrina then left to go to the shopping center across the street from the bank to call Kurt, because she could not use the bank's phone. Sabrina was inside the Kmart speaking with Bob for 20 to 30 minutes while Kurt waited for her outside. After she came out of the store, Kurt drove her back to the apartment he and Patty shared. At the Lintons' apartment, Sabrina made several phone calls. Most of them were to inquire about apartments for rent, and one was to her mother, who was at work. Sabrina told Kurt that her mother had agreed to help her move her clothes over to the Lintons' apartment after her shift was over that afternoon. Patty arrived at the apartment on her lunch break around 11:40. She made them all lunch and then left to go back to work after they ate. Sabrina offered to do the dishes, and Kurt began looking at his phonograph. He decided it needed a new needle and told Sabrina he was going to make a quick trip to the store to buy one. Between 12:30 and 12:35, Kurt was leaving the shopping center, having purchased the needle, waiting to turn left on to bypass Route 50. While he was waiting for a break in the traffic, he saw Sabrina's blue Plymouth Satellite with a floral top drive by, heading west on bypass Route 50. When the car drove past him, he saw Sabrina sitting in its passenger seat, her long blonde hair blowing in the wind. The initial statement Kurt would make to police states that he saw Sabrina's stepfather, Fred Rourke, driving the car. However, in a subsequent interview, he would clarify that this had been a misunderstanding and that he had not been able to see who had been driving the car. Kurt had left his key to his apartment with Sabrina, so he was unable to return home. He instead went straight to his job at the Kresge store. He was able to later provide police with such a specific window of time when he had seen Sabrina drive past him because the exact time he made it to work shortly thereafter was recorded on his time card. When Patty Linton returned to work after her lunch break, she was told that Fred Rourke had called asking to speak with her several times while she was gone. Not wanting to continue receiving such calls at her place of employment, she called him back. He asked her what the trouble with Sabrina was. She told him that she was not sure, but that Sabrina was determined to move out on her own. Patty also told him that Sabrina was at her apartment if he wanted to go talk to her. Fred Rourke would later say that he had gone over to the Lintons' apartment to speak with his stepdaughter. Sabrina let him inside the apartment and then agreed to go home to speak with him. She left Patty a note and then she and her stepfather left to drive home. When they arrived, Fred sat down on the couch and Sabrina sat down on the arm of a chair near the front door, leaving her coat on. He asked her what was wrong, and instead of responding, Sabrina got up and walked out of the house. Rourke did not go after her. When Sabrina's mother, Lorraine, returned home from work that afternoon, Fred was there, but Sabrina was not. Fred told her Sabrina had been angry and walked out of the house. Lorraine Rourke then went out looking for her daughter, but Fred did not go with her to help. Patty Linton arrived home from work at 3:45 and found the note from Sabrina explaining that she had gone home with Fred and saying that she would call her later. Patty later tried calling Sabrina at home and was told by Laureen that Sabrina had stormed out of the house earlier that afternoon. Kurt Linton returned from work at 6 o'clock that evening, and the couple remained at home waiting for a call from Sabrina that never came. Fred Rourke claimed that Sabrina had walked out of his house sometime between 1 and 1:30 in the afternoon on February 5, 1974. She never returned home, and there were no later sightings of her. Despite this, her mother and stepfather did not report her missing until March 22nd, more than 6 weeks after she disappeared. Frank claimed that he had not reported Sabrina missing any earlier because she had run away from home before but had always come home eventually. While Sabrina had been trying to leave home in the days before her disappearance, she had remained in almost constant contact with her mother and friends about her whereabouts. She had specific plans to prepare to move out on her own. She left home without any of her clothes, which were very important to her, or any money. The day before she went missing, she told a coworker that she only had $3 as she had recently given her mother $50. Furthermore, it was highly out of character for Fred Rourke to let Sabrina's whereabouts be unknown for 6 hours, much less 6 weeks. According to Sabrina's friends and coworkers, her relationship with her stepfather was highly unusual. She would fail to show up to planned activities because she had to spend time with him. He tried to control who she was friends with, and he forbade her from dating. When she had been in high school, he would often come pick her up after school to ensure that she was not spending time with boys or friends he did not approve of after classes ended for the day. Sabrina graduated high school in 1973, but Fred would not allow her any new freedoms, and his behavior remained just as controlling as ever. He seemed to be hyper-focused on Sabrina and her whereabouts. He held the use of her car over her head to try to influence her behavior. Sabrina had been without access to the car and reliant on others for rides just before she vanished because she had gotten so frustrated with this behavior that she had thrown the car's keys at Fred following an argument. She would rather be without a car rather than let her stepfather continue using her access to one in this way. Sabrina had confided in a few people about instances where her stepfather would strike her or push her down. He had once thrown her against a wall and then used his hands to rub makeup off of her eyes because he did not like her wearing it. She told a coworker at Midwest Savings and Loan that her mother had once tried to intervene on her behalf, but Fred had then struck her as well. When Sabrina had started her job at Midwest Savings and Loan in October of 1973, her coworkers viewed her as outgoing and personable. The stress that she was under at home seemed to weigh heavily on her, however. Her coworkers, like her boyfriend, had noted that Sabrina had been especially anxious in December of 1973. Sabrina had also come into work on at least one occasion in tears over her stepfather's behavior. On April 20, 1974, 2 men were target shooting in Stuckey Township, west of Belleville. In Forney Lake, off of Town Hall Road, they observed what appeared to be a body floating in the water, some 30 feet from the shore. They went to the home of a sheriff's deputy who lived nearby to report what they had observed. The civil defense was called in to use a boat to extract the body from the water and bring it to shore. The assistant coroner had been called to the scene, and he identified the body, badly decomposed from its time in the water, as that of a white female. His preliminary examination showed bullet wounds to the back of her head, her shoulder, and her back. The woman's hands had been bound behind her back and a concrete block had been tied to her waist, presumably to weigh her body down. She was wearing 4 rings, one of which was a Belleville West class ring bearing the initials SJ. The Belleville Police Department notified the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office that they had a missing persons report filed on someone who matched the description of the woman found in the lake, Sabrina Jean Cain. They were also advised that her stepfather was an officer with the department. Fred Rourke was then brought in and asked to identify the rings the young woman had been found wearing. He positively identified the class ring as belonging to Sabrina and made a tentative identification of the other 3 rings. Rourke was very upset during this initial interaction at the sheriff's department, and after describing the last time he had seen Sabrina, he asked to see the clothing found on the body so that he could be positive that it was Sabrina. He was therefore brought to the Gardner Funeral Home where the body had been taken. He was able to confirm that the clothes found with the body belonged to Sabrina. The items of clothing matched the descriptions given of the clothes Sabrina had been wearing on the day she disappeared, provided by the people who had seen her that day. Rourke was also able to identify Sabrina's underwear and noted that she had purchased that pair not long before she went missing. While he was advised against it, Rourke also asked to see Sabrina's body. He was unable to make an identification due to its condition. The area near the pond where Sabrina's body had been found was heavily wooded, and authorities had used a local radio station to appeal for volunteers to help search it. After meeting with the sheriff's department and going to the funeral home, Fred Rourke showed up as one of those volunteers. He arrived at the scene at approximately 6:45 p.m. with one of his neighbors, Jack Erlanger. Rourke asked the deputies at the scene if anyone had searched the trestle on the road half a mile west of the lake for Sabrina's purse. When he was told no, he and Jack went to do so. When they returned, they said that they did not find anything. Jack Erlanger would later say that Borg was never out of his sight during their search. Sabrina's father, Cork Cain, lived in Arcola, Illinois, approximately 150 miles northeast of Belleville. He had remarried after his divorce from Laureen and lived with his wife and their daughter, Sabrina's 7-year-old half-sister Kimberly. Laureen and Fred Rourke did not notify him when Sabrina went missing. Cork and his wife heard on the news that the body of a young woman with long blonde hair had been found in a pond while they were spending the weekend in St. Louis. They did not learn until the following day when a family member called them that the body had been Sabrina's. Cork had been left unaware that anything had happened to his daughter during the 2.5 months she was missing and never notified of her death by her mother or stepfather, and was left to hear of it indirectly. Fred Rourke claimed that he had looked for Sabrina after she went missing, and some of Sabrina's friends did report that Fred had asked them about Sabrina's whereabouts after she disappeared. However, despite being a police officer, Rourke apparently did not believe that checking with Sabrina's father or anyone on his side of her family would be beneficial to his investigation into her whereabouts. In his initial interview with police, after he identified Sabrina's rings and learned that her body had been found, Rourke had told police that he had even traveled to Sabrina's hometown of Tuscola, Illinois, trying to find her. Arcola, where Cork Cain lived, is just south of Tuscola, but Rourke did not stop there to see if Sabrina had been in contact with him. Cork and Kimberly Cain were able to attend Sabrina's funeral, but were excluded from her obituary. During the course of their investigation, authorities continued to hear stories of Fred Rourke's allegedly abusive and controlling behavior towards Sabrina from her friends and co-workers. These accounts focused investigators' attention on Rourke. During an interview at the sheriff's department the day after Sabrina's body was discovered, Rourke claimed that he had nothing to hide. He consented to a search of his home and boat and to the examination of his personal firearm, which fired the same caliber of bullets found in Sabrina's body during her autopsy. 3 officers from the sheriff's department therefore went to the Rourke residence after the interview was completed. Rourke's boat was searched to see if he used the same kind of tow rope he used to tie the concrete block to Sabrina's body, but none was found. When asked to produce his firearm, a .380 automatic, Rourke told the officers that it was on a chest of drawers in his bedroom. When he went to retrieve it, however, it was not there. He and Lorraine looked for it throughout the house but could not find it. Rourke then suggested to the officers that he may have left the firearm at a home he had been renovating approximately 2.5 miles away from his residence. Fred Rourke, the officers, and Lorraine Rourke then drove to that house. Rourke unlocked the door and let them all inside. He then went straight to a closet, glanced inside, and told the officers that the gun was not inside of it. One of the officers noted in his report that it was too dark inside the unlit closet for anyone to be able to actually see anything inside of it. The rest of the house was searched for the weapon without success. Rourke then suggested that the gun must have been stolen at some point. If a thief had gotten inside of the locked home, the gun was the only item they took, and they left behind a gold watch and numerous hand and power tools being used in the renovation of the house. The officers informed Rourke that several people, including a sergeant with the Belleville Police Department, had seen him with the weapon recently. Rourke then told them that he may have had the weapon with him when he had searched the area around the lake where Sabrina's body had been found the day before. He and the officers therefore went back to Forney Lake, where he showed them the exact areas he and Jack Erlanger had searched and looked for the gun. He could not locate it. Rourke assured the officers that he would turn over the weapon should he ever find it. Without the actual gun, the sheriffs then tried to locate slugs fired from the weapon to compare to the ones taken from Sabrina's body. On April 23rd, officers went to a farm owned by Fred Rourke's father, John Rourke. Fred Rourke had mentioned that he had used the .380 automatic for target practice on his father's property. John Rourke confirmed that both he and his son had fired the weapon and showed them where on the property they had done so. The officers began sifting and digging through the soil. They initially only found .22 caliber slugs and .38 caliber reloads. Eventually, they did find what they believed could be a .380 slug. However, when it was taken to the St. Louis Police Department laboratory, they learned that it was actually a 9mm slug. The FBI examined the bullets and bullet fragments found in Sabrina's body, as well as the 9mm bullet found at John Rourke's farm at the end of 1974. They listed the model of Fred Rourke's gun as one of several that left rifling impressions consistent with those found on the bullets from Sabrina's autopsy, but obviously could not say if it was the specific weapon used, as they had no bullet fired from it for comparison. Rourke's weapon was never located and therefore never tied to the crime. At the beginning of his interview on April 21st, Rourke had been asked to undergo a polygraph examination. He said no. Later in the interview and at the end of it, however, he said he would be willing to submit to a polygraph. When it came time to actually schedule the examination, however, he reverted back to his original position and refused to come in for it. On April 25, 1974, Michael Mercurio, the acting chief of police of the Belleville Police Department, ordered Rourke to submit to the polygraph and advised him that he would be fired from the department if he failed to do so. Burke filed for an injunction challenging the order, with the court ruling in his favor. In his decision, St. Clair County Circuit Judge Joseph Cunningham ruled that the order violated Burke's constitutional rights against self-incrimination. When a second order to appear for a polygraph was issued, however, the same judge upheld it, now stating that by halting the order, the court would be injecting itself into the administration of the city. Rourke did eventually appear for the polygraph on May 22nd, but refused to answer any questions beyond providing his name, occupation, and address. In a letter addressed to the Belleville Board of Fire and Police Commissioners, Acting Chief Mercurio wrote that to all questions presented to him, he refused to answer on the grounds that it might tend to incriminate him. Rourke had initially been suspended with pay while Sabrina's case was being investigated. After his refusal to cooperate at his polygraph, he was suspended without pay from the police force at the end of May of 1974. He was fired the following month for conduct unbecoming of an officer and disobeying a direct order. His dismissal was the result of a unanimous decision by the Belleville Board of Fire and Police Commissioners. Rourke went back to court to challenge his dismissal from the police force, but the circuit court upheld it in January of 1975. A coroner's inquest into Sabrina's death was held in the beginning of May 1974. Both Fred and Lorraine Rourke refused to testify during the proceedings, both invoking the Fifth Amendment. Lorraine had testified during a St. Clair County Circuit Court grand jury 2 days prior. The inquest ruled that Sabrina's death was a homicide committed by an unknown individual or individuals. On March 7, 1975, Fred Rourke was arrested and charged with Sabrina's murder. His lawyers requested and were granted a change in venue due to the amount of attention the case received in the local media in St. Clair County. His October 1975 trial was therefore held in Quincy, Illinois in Adams County. The prosecution's case against Rourke was almost entirely circumstantial. Witnesses testified that he appeared to have a pistol in his right hip pocket when he came to search the area around Forney Lake the day Sabrina's body was discovered. Potentially the same pistol that Rourke would claim had somehow been lost or stolen when police asked to examine it the following day. Other witnesses testified to the fact that Rourke had purchased a .380 pistol in 1971, that Sabrina had been killed by bullets fired from that same type of firearm, and that Rourke was familiar with the area around Forney Lake because he had previously gone target shooting there. St. Clair County Sheriff's Department Sergeant Charles Earhart also testified that he had examined Sabrina's Plymouth Satellite, the same car Kurt Linton had seen her riding as a passenger in on the day she went missing, a short time after her body was found. The carpet in the trunk of the car had been damp, as though it had just been washed. A major witness for the prosecution was Donald Martindale, a 19-year-old former employee of the International House of Pancakes on West Main Street in Belleville. Martindale testified that on the morning of June 9, 1974, a seemingly intoxicated Fred Rourke had stumbled into the restaurant. Martindale said that he had been sitting in a booth with Cukers, a married couple who operated the restaurant. Rourke came up to them and the Cukers told Martindale to leave, so he moved 2 booths away. Martindale could still hear the conversation Rourke was having with his managers and testified that he heard a sobbing Rourke say, "I didn't mean to kill her." When Mrs. Cuker asked him who he was talking about, he replied, "Sabrina, I didn't mean to make her pregnant." A short time later, Mrs. Cuker asked Martindale, "You heard something out there, didn't you?" When Martindale said that he had, Mrs. Cuker told him that there was nothing to what he had heard and that she would talk to Rourke in the morning. Rourke at that time was passed out in the booth. Martindale did not immediately report what he had overheard because he assumed Mrs. Cuker would be doing something about it. Several weeks later, he mentioned the conversation to a friend, who was the son of a Belleville police officer. The friend convinced him to go to the police with his account. Rourke's attorneys attacked Martindale's credibility and the details of his story. They called Mr. and Mrs. Cukier as witnesses, and they both denied that the conversation had taken place. They further claimed that they had not even been at the restaurant at the time Martindale described in his testimony, and that Martindale's employment at the restaurant had ended the day before he said he had heard the conversation. However, their testimony about why he was no longer employed there did not match up. Mrs. Cukier said that Martindale had been fired, whereas Mr. Cukier said that Martindale had quit and left on friendly terms. Martindale disputed their account of the timing of the end of his employment, saying it came after June 9th. During his testimony, Martindale acknowledged that he had been arrested by Rourke for a curfew violation and 2 traffic offenses in 1973. Martindale said on the stand that he did not resent Rourke for arresting him because he'd just been doing his job. The defense, however, brought up the fact that Martindale had been arrested 6 times between the ages of 14 and 17, again for curfew and traffic violations. He had been arrested again 3 days before he said he overheard Rourke confessing in the restaurant by one of Rourke's former riding partners. Martindale had been given a polygraph prior to being called as a witness in court and had passed it, but that information could not legally be shared with the jury. Martindale's assertion Rourke brought up Sabrina being pregnant does tie in with other witness testimony. While Sabrina's autopsy showed that she had not been pregnant at the time of her death, Rourke had been fixated on the possibility of her being pregnant since the early days of the investigation into her murder. When Rourke was interviewed by the sheriff's department the day Sabrina's body was found, he was asked if he knew of anyone who had a motive to harm her. For some reason, Rourke took this to mean that the investigator thought Sabrina had been pregnant. The investigator noted in his report that he had made no such insinuation. Sabrina's friend, Jean Morrisaw, and her mother had gone to see Lorraine Rourke after Sabrina's body was found. While they were at the Rourke home, the county coroner called, and Fred Rourke went into another room to speak with him on the phone. When he came back into the room, he announced to everyone, well, she wasn't pregnant, much to the shock of his wife and guests. Lorraine asked her husband why anyone would have thought Sabrina had been pregnant, at which point Jean pointed out that it could have been a potential motive for someone to want to kill her. Jean's mother found the look Fred Rourke gave Jean in response to this statement disturbing, and she quickly ended their visit. This was not Jean's first concerning visit to the Rourke household since Sabrina's initial disappearance. Fred Rourke had called her a few days after Sabrina went missing asking her if she knew anything about his stepdaughter's whereabouts. She did not. She paid Lorraine Rourke a visit a few days later to talk about Sabrina. Lorraine took Jean into Sabrina's bedroom to show her the brand new clothes left in the closet, still with their tags attached. Lorraine showed them to Jean because she did not believe that anyone would just leave without taking the clothes with them. To open the closet, Lorraine had to move a rug that was blocking its door. After showing Jean the new clothes Sabrina had left behind, Lorraine tried to close the closet door. It was at this time that Jean noticed a large amount of blood on the carpet under the rug that had been blocking the door. When Jean asked about it, Lorraine claimed that it was from Fred hurting himself when he tried to see if Sabrina had taken anything with her. Jean did not immediately report the blood stain. When Sabrina's body was found months later, however, she realized its potential significance and went to the police. By the time they went to the house to investigate her account, however, the blood was gone. Rourke's trial lasted for 4 days. On October 17, 1975, after 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Rourke not guilty. Chief Assistant St. Clair County State's Attorney Richard Aguirre told the press after the verdict was returned that he had known that there had only been an outside chance of him securing a conviction in the case because of the circumstantial nature of the evidence he presented. He also said that his office considered Sabrina's case closed because he was still convinced of Rourke's guilt. From a legal perspective, however, Rourke is considered not guilty. Sabrina's case remains unsolved, and no one has ever been brought to justice for her murder. Aguirre's personal confidence aside, the case would have needed to remain open so that further investigation could hopefully produce definitive answers in the case. Fred Rourke never returned to the police force. He worked as a roofer while his case was pending and eventually became a truck driver. He was killed in an accident in St. Louis in November of 1978 when his truck struck a pole after another car cut him off while he was driving. Lorraine Rourke had Fred buried next to Sabrina. Lorraine married her third husband 2 years later in 1980. She passed away in March of 2008, 10 months after suffering from a stroke at the age of 71. Sabrina's father, Cork Cain, passed away in October of 2013. Her sister, Kimberly, despite her own interest in finding out the truth of Sabrina's murder, limited her own investigative efforts while their father was still alive so as not to upset him. It was too painful for him, she told the Belleville News-Democrat in 2018. His way to deal with it to just not talk about it. Kimberly's increased and ongoing efforts have so far not conclusively closed Sabrina's case, but she has been able to solve one mystery that plagued her for more than 4 decades, the location of her sister's grave. The Cain side of Sabrina's family was not notified of the location where she was buried, and at least one local newspaper misidentified the cemetery. In 2018, 44 years after Sabrina's death, Kimberly finally learned where her sister was buried. She is now able to visit her sister in her final resting place and bring her flowers. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.